Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or to change a vote? If not on this vote, the yeas are 44, the nays are 54. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
I mean, in fact, there was a Supreme Court case a few years ago.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on amendment number 625, offered by the senator from Arizona, Mr. McCain, and there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to the vote.
Mr. President, the Senate's not in order.
The Senate come to order, please. Senate come to order.
You've got to speak.
You're not going to miss a thing.
Senators, please take their conversations out of the well, off the chamber. Senator is correct. The Senate, we need the Senate in order to debate this amendment. We need to give our respect to Senator McCain on his amendment.
President, the stimulus passed
Senator
in
from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. President, the stimulus passed in 2009 was purported to be temporary. As part of that massive piece of legislation, we added made a significant expansion and added at least $600 million a year more to the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. This amendment would cut back to the pre-stimulus number, the TAA. It's pretty simple. It'll save at least $600 million per year on questionable programs of questionable effectiveness. But the point is that the stimulus was supposed to be a temporary increase in spending and not a permanent one. Now the Reid package makes that most of it, at least 65% of it, permanent. At least we could cut it back to pre-stimulus levels.
This change in stimulus?
Supported by the National Taxpayers Union. I know that'll be very persuasive to my friends on the other side of the aisle.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana is recognized.
Mr. President, this country has extremely high... Mr. President, the Senate's not in order.
Will the Senate please come to order so we can finish the debate on the amendment? Senators, please take their conversations out of the well and off the floor. Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, this country has extremely high unemployment rate, we all know. A lot of people losing jobs, some losing jobs on account of trade. The world's changed even as recently as 2002. In 2002, the law said, okay, if you lose a job on account of job loss goes to a free trade agreement country, you're eligible for trade adjustment assistance, and it has to be a manufacturing job. That was changed in 2009 because the country's changed. There are a lot of countries with whom we trade that are not FTA partners, China, India. It makes eminent sense if somebody loses a job on account of trade with any country, that person should be eligible for trade adjustment assistance, not just FTA countries. And second, we should expand to services. 80% of the workers in our country are in the services sector, not manufacturing services. And that addition was also provided for in 2009. And technical reason, too, this amendment passes, it jeopardizes both TAA as well as FTAs because everything has to be renegotiated. So I urge this amendment not be agreed to.
All time has expired. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
Scott Brown, yes.
Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hogan. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans. Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Heller, Hoeven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Hatch, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Conrad, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Sanders, Schumer, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, no. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Brown of Ohio, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Begich, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or to change a vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 46, the nays are 53. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask consent that Senator Hatch or his designee be recognized to offer amendment number 642. That following the reporting of the Hatch amendment, Senator Cornyn be recognized for debate only for up to 15 minutes. That Senator Kyle or his designee be recognized to offer amendment number 645 anytime prior to 5 p.m. That the time until 5 p.m. be for debate on the Hatch and Kyle amendments and be equally divided between the two leaders or their designees. That at 5 p.m. the Senate proceed to votes in relation to the Hatch and Kyle amendments in that order. That there be no amendments, points of order, motions in order to either amendment prior to the votes, other than budget points of order and the applicable motions to waive. That each amendment be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold, and there be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to each vote.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
President,
Senator from Utah is recognized.
send an amendment to the desk and ask for its immediate consideration. Amendment number 642.
Senator from Utah, Mr. Hatch, proposes an amendment number 642 to amendment number
Mr. President,
633.
I ask unanimous consent to reading of amendment.
Without objection. Senator from Texas is recognized.
Mr. President, we're talking about trade. How do we create markets for things that Americans grow or build and sell abroad, which creates jobs here at home? But I'd like to talk about a rather specialized area of trade, and that has to do with foreign military sales. And particularly, I'd like to talk about a topic that Senator Menendez and I introduced a bill on last week called the Taiwan Air Power Modernization Act of 2011. This bill requires the United States government to respond to the request of the government of Taiwan for the sale of at least 66 F-16 C and D fighter aircraft to Taiwan. Now, that sounds like a mouthful and a big subject, and it is, but let me try to put some meat on the bone and explain why I think this is so important. Support of the people of Taiwan has been a bipartisan priority for decades. Democrats and Republicans supported the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan signed by President Eisenhower in 1954. And Democrats and Republicans came together and passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which was signed by President Carter in 1979, and which remains the law of the land today. The Taiwan Relations Act states that the United States will provide to Taiwan the defense articles necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain sufficient self-defense capabilities in furtherance of maintaining peace and stability in the Western Pacific region. So what does sufficient self-defense capabilities mean? Well, President Reagan, in a memorandum dated August the 17th, 1982, laid it out. This is about the time that the third communique between Communist China and the U.S. was formally adopted by the United States and China, because the Chinese wanted to know, what exactly does this mean? Is this a threat of aggressive weaponry, or is this purely for defensive purposes? Well, this memorandum from President Reagan on August the 17th, 1982 lays it out, and let me just read it quickly. It is essential that the quantity and the quality of the arms provided to Taiwan be conditioned entirely on the threat posed by the People's Republic of China. Both in quantitative and qualitative terms, Taiwan's defense capability relative to that of the PRC will be maintained. So this is strictly for the purpose of giving Taiwan the ability to defend itself against potential aggressive actions by Communist China. According to James Lilly, who was America's top representative in Taiwan at the time, and who later served as ambassador to China under George Herbert Walker Bush, that's what this was designed to do, to crystallize what the nature of the weapons sales to the Taiwan government would be used for. And it was directly proportional to and reciprocal to the threat posed by the People's Republic of China. But Ronald Reagan was not alone in this interpretation. In fact, both Democrats and Republicans over the years have supported numerous arms sales to the government of Taiwan, including the current request for 66 F-16 C and D advanced fighter aircraft. So far, just this year, 47 Republicans and Democrats have signed a letter, these are senators, to the administration in support of this sale. And in August, 181 members of the House of Representatives, Republicans and Democrats alike, have written to the administration endorsing this same sale. Why is Taiwan asking for these aircraft? And why do so many Democrats and Republicans join together when the parties seem to be so polarized by so many other issues and come together in a bipartisan way on this issue? Well, the answer is simple and straightforward. Taiwan's air defense capabilities are nearly obsolete, while China's air capabilities are growing at an alarming rate. This chart demonstrates the problem. On the right, in the red, you'll see that China has 2,300 operational military combat aircraft, while Taiwan has 490 operational aircraft. But air defense is not just a numbers game. Quality of those aircraft matter a lot, just as much as quantity. So what about the quality of Taiwan's existing forces? According to our own intelligence services, the Defense Intelligence Agency, in an unclassified report last year, They said that many of Taiwan's fighter aircraft are close to or beyond service life, and many require extensive maintenance support. China's capabilities, on the other hand, are clearly newer and clearly growing and clearly focused on intimidating Taiwan and the United States. China's official press agency reported in March that the People's Republic of China will increase its military budget this year by 12%, after an increase last year of 7.5%. But the Pentagon estimates that China's official military budget is about $90 billion, far less, or excuse me, I have that backward, that the $90 billion they disclose is actually $150 billion. In other words, they only disclose part of their expenditures on national security and not the full amount, which is some $150 billion. The question is, who does China intimidate with this growing military power? Here's what the Pentagon had to say in its 2011 report to Congress called Military and Security Development Involving the People's Republic of China. The Defense Department observed that China continued modernizing its military in 2010 with a focus on Taiwan contingencies. The Pentagon also noted that China's Air Force will remain primarily focused on building the capabilities required to pose a credible military threat to Taiwan and U.S. forces in East Asia. Let me repeat that. The Pentagon noted that China's Air Force will remain primarily focused on building the capabilities required to pose a credible military threat to Taiwan and U.S. forces in East Asia. Some say that the United States should not look at our policy with Taiwan in a vacuum, that we should consider the context of our larger strategic relationship with China. I couldn't agree more, because the strategic situation with China these days is very troubling. Many of China's neighbors are concerned about its military buildup and territorial ambitions. Last year, China claimed the South China Sea as a core interest, which unsettled Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and other nations in the region. China also renewed a long-running dispute with India over the borders of the Arunachal Pradesh region. China continues to be an enabler of the nuclear ambitions and regime in North Korea. This summer, Google publicly reported that a Chinese entity had been targeting the personal email accounts of U.S. and South Korean government employees. And Pakistan's defense minister publicly discussed the possibility of China building a naval base at Gudar, Pakistan, which is already home to a new strategically important port at the mouth of the Gulf of Oman. China, we know, has also escalated its rhetoric aimed at the United States, and particularly the United States Senate. A number of my colleagues visited Beijing last April, where they reportedly received a lecture from the Chinese officials on fiscal policy. And just last week, more to the point of this topic, China's top official newspaper used a lot of unnecessary and bellicose rhetoric on the subject of the proposed U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. This official newspaper of the Communist Party in China said that those of us on Capitol Hill who support Taiwan are madmen. They said we're playing with fire. And they said if we would pay a disastrous price if we continued to support our ally, Taiwan, as we are obligated to do by the Taiwan Relations Act. Mr. President, I suggest that the United States should not give in to this intimidation and these threats, and that we should instead pass this legislation to send a clear message to China that respects only strength, not weakness, that the real madmen are those who think America will abandon our friends and allies and our principles and our long-standing strategic interest in the stability of East Asia. Supporting this legislation, Mr. President, would also greatly reassure our allies and friends around the world. Many remember what happened when President Clinton deployed 2 aircraft carrier battle groups during the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996. That crisis developed when China tried to intimidate Taiwan on the eve of its first free presidential elections by conducting a series, I should say, of military exercises that included the firing of missiles just a few miles north of Taiwan. President Clinton responded by ordering the largest U.S. military force since the Vietnam War to deploy to the region, including carrier battle groups led by the USS Nimitz and the USS Independence. America's show of resolve under President Clinton's leadership did not escalate the crisis. It diffused it, and it sent a welcome signal to our friends and allies in the region. According to an article in the current issue of Washington Quarterly, following the crisis, the region's confidence in the United States soared. Japan, Singapore, the Philippines, and other nations all bolstered their security ties with the United States. The Taiwan Strait crisis was one of the real foreign policy success stories of the Clinton administration. But the authors of this same article conclude that forsaking Taiwan now would likely have the opposite effect. Mr. President, this bill deserves bipartisan support of the majority of members of the United States Senate based on our long-standing bipartisan consensus on our policy toward Taiwan, on the growing gap in military capabilities between the People's Republic of China and the government of Taiwan, based on China's aggressive behavior toward its neighbors and toward the United States, and America's credibility with our allies and with free peoples everywhere. But I want to conclude by pointing out perhaps something that's obvious, but maybe it's not so obvious to everyone. Since we're talking about trade, the things we grow and we sell to people abroad, creating jobs at home, it's worth mentioning that selling F-16 aircraft to Taiwan creates jobs and exports for the U.S. economy and does not cost 1 penny of taxpayer money. This map demonstrates that all the states, all these yellow states in which direct and indirect employment from this export sale of F-16s to Taiwan is projected to be at least 60 person-years of employment, which is the equivalent of 10 American workers employed full-time for 6 years. As you can see from this map, 30 states will have that level of job creation or more as a result of the sale of these F-16s, making the sale of the F-16s to Taiwan a coast-to-coast job engine. In fact, according to the Perryman Group, the requested sale of F-16C Ds and Ds to Taiwan would generate some $8.7 billion in output and directly support 2,300 jobs. Excuse me, 23,000 jobs. I got that off by 90%. Let me read that again. The requested sale of F-16Cs and Ds to Taiwan would generate some $8.7 billion in output and directly support more than 23,000 jobs. As I pointed out earlier, Mr. President, these jobs don't cost the American people 1 cent. These are private sector jobs paid for with money coming in from overseas because this is an export-driven industry. The only thing the United States government needs to do is get out of the way and let these Americans continue to stay on the job and collect an estimated $768 million in federal tax revenues. Yes, not only will we be selling these, creating jobs, we'll be generating revenue for the federal treasury in the process, generated by this private sector, export-driven economic activity. I want to thank the Senator from New Jersey, Senator Menendez, for introducing this legislation with me, and thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who have agreed to co-sponsor. And I hope more senators will join us, and I hope we will pass this bill soon. I hope we can help American workers continue building these aircraft, and to strengthen our friends, the people of Taiwan. Mr. President, let me just close on this comment that this is standalone legislation that I've discussed here today, but I'll be offering in due course an amendment to the pending bill that would mandate this sale. And so I would ask my colleagues to please join us in a bipartisan way of showing our support for our friends and allies in Taiwan and generating jobs right here at home. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, my state of Vermont has been hit very, very hard by Hurricane Irene. Widespread flooding caused a number of deaths, the loss of many homes and businesses, and hundreds of millions, perhaps $1 billion, in damage to property and infrastructure. I have visited many of the most hard-hit towns, and I have been shocked and moved by the extent of the damage that I saw. Irene will go down in history as one of the very worst natural disasters ever to hit the state of Vermont. Let me just share a few facts with you about the extent of the damage. Already, more than 5,200 Vermonters have registered with FEMA. Remember, we're a state of only 630,000 people and approximately 200,000 households, and yet more than 5,200 Vermonters have already registered with FEMA. Mr. President, more than 700 homes were severely damaged or completely destroyed. 700 in a state which has about 200,000 households. Between 1,500 and 2,000 families have been displaced, their housing uncertain as we approach Vermont's brutally cold winter season, and it is beginning to get cold in Vermont. More than 73,000 homes were left without electricity, a third of all of the homes in our state. Tens of thousands of Vermonters lost their phone service, and in some areas these services still have not been fully restored. Mr. President, more than 2,000 roads were badly damaged, 2,000 roads, including 135 segments of state highways. More than 300 bridges were damaged. Hundreds of roads and bridges remain closed, while many others are only open to emergency vehicles today. Some towns still have limited access because the roads and bridges that link them to the outside world were destroyed. Further, dozens of town libraries, town halls, municipal and volunteer fire departments have been damaged or destroyed. 90 public schools could not open on time. The last one is just now opening for the year. Hundreds of businesses and more than 360 farms with more than 15,000 acres of farmland have been damaged, tearing at the fabric of our rural economy. Our Amtrak and freight services were completely suspended as rail beds literally washed into rivers. One Amtrak line is still down today. The largest state office complex was completely flooded and is closed until further notice. 1,600 state employees cannot go to work in that building. Important files and computer systems have been ruined, disrupting the ability of the state to deliver critical state functions. Mr. President, I know that as in times past, we will pick up the pieces in Vermont and restore our homes and business. And I have to tell you that if there is any silver lining out of that disaster, it is the fact that in community after community, people came out, worked together, and participated in cleanup efforts, supported each other. People from the northern part of the state, which was hit less severely, came down to the southern part of the state, helped out. Strangers helped strangers. It was an extraordinary effort of people coming together. But the simple fact of the matter is that if a state like Vermont has communities that are devastated. A state like New Jersey has communities that are devastated. We cannot do it alone. The scale of this disaster is too overwhelming for a state of the size of Vermont. The federal government has long played an important role in disaster recovery. That's something we have known for many, many years, and we have seen time after time after time. When our fellow citizens in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast suffered the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, people in Vermont were there for them, and I can tell you how many people told me that we have got to do everything that we can to protect the people who were devastated by Katrina. When the citizens of Joplin, Missouri were hit by deadly tornadoes, people on the West Coast were there for them. And of course, when terrorists attacked the United States on 9/11, we were all there for New York City. That is what being a nation is about. The name of our country is the United States of America. United, U-N-I-T-E-D. And if that name means anything, it means that when disaster strikes one part of the countries, and when communities are devastated, and when people are hurt, and when bridges and roads are out, and when farmers can't produce the food, we as a nation rally together to support those communities. And that is what states impacted by Irene expect from Congress, because that is what being a nation is about. Disaster relief funded on an emergency basis is what Congress has done for decades, and it is what Congress must do now. The Senate did the right thing in quickly passing a $6.9 billion disaster relief supplemental appropriations bill, and I want to thank all of the people active in that, from Senator Reid to Senator Landrieu to Senator Leahy, all of the people who made that happen. They did a great job. Does that bill have everything that I would like to see in a disaster relief bill for the state of Vermont? No, it doesn't, quite frankly. But it is a very good bill. It is an urgently needed bill. It is an important step forward in the right direction. And I want to commend again all of those senators who played an active role in moving that bill along, including 10 Senate Republicans. Disaster aid should not be a partisan issue, but it seems the House Republicans are intent on making it one. The disaster funding that the House is likely to pass this week is totally inadequate and will not address the magnitude of the damages inflicted by Hurricane Irene or to the backlog in FEMA funding that existed before it. To my mind, it is an outrage that for the first time in modern American history, House Republicans want to have a budget debate over disaster assistance. They threaten to block urgently needed aid unless the cost of that help is offset by cuts in other needed programs. They want to use Hurricane Irene as another excuse for a budget fight. And think about the precedent that that sets. Now, what happens if tomorrow there is, God forbid, a disaster in New Mexico or a disaster in Colorado? Does that mean we should be cutting education or environmental protection in order to pay for help to New Mexico or Colorado or California? If there is a major earthquake someplace in this country and communities are devastated, do we cut back on the needs of the children? Do we cut back on Medicare and have that huge debate in order to pay for disaster relief? Historically, what the United States Congress has said, and what they said was right, that when disaster strikes, we as a nation come together and we provide the support to those communities who have been hurt to get them back on their feet. That is what we have done in this great country. And I am offended that some of my Republican colleagues in the House suddenly start thinking that we need a major budget debate for every disaster that is hitting this country. That is wrong. That is extraordinarily bad public policy. That is, frankly, unpatriotic and not what the United States is about. Yes, of course, we must continue to address our deficit problem, but not on the backs of communities in Vermont, New Jersey, North Carolina, or other states that have been devastated by Hurricane Irene. For those states and communities, we must get them emergency help, and we must get it to them as quickly as possible. Amazingly, I must say this, that this talk about budget offsets for disaster relief comes from some of the same people who repeatedly and conveniently ignore their own actions when it suits them. Mr. President, Congress provided $800 billion to bail out Wall Street banks. I didn't hear any discussion about offsets when it came to bailing out Wall Street. Congress extended huge tax breaks and loopholes for the wealthiest people in this country, driving up the deficit. I didn't hear any call for offsets when we gave tax breaks to billionaires and large corporations. The United States is spending today $160 billion a year on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, including billions to rebuild those countries. I didn't hear any call for offsets when it came to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mr. President, let me conclude by saying this. This country has its share of problems. We all know that. But if we forsake the essence of what we are as a nation, and that is we stand together when disaster strikes, if we forego that, if we no longer live up to that ideal, I worry very, very much about the future of our great nation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, last week the Senate passed 3 important pieces of bipartisan legislation. It was really quite a productive week. We reauthorized the Federal Aviation Administration. That kept 80,000 workers, including safety inspectors on the job. We passed a highway bill that keeps 1.8 million people at work, building roads and bridges and dams. We reached a bipartisan agreement to rush relief to communities devastated by floods, tornadoes, and wildfires. So I was hopeful as this week began that it would be productive. I thought Congress might be able to set aside party politics to accomplish the important work of this nation. Instead, the Tea Party's taken over again. Tea Party Republicans have once again allowed partisanship to rear its ugly head. Now House Republicans, obsessed with pleasing a group of radicals, Tea Party they're called, are refusing to give the Federal Emergency Management Agency the funding it needs to reconstruct ravaged communities across this great country. And they're threatening to shut down government if they don't get what they want. It's bad enough we can't agree that victims of flood and fire should get the help they need without delay. Now we can't even agree on what we've already agreed to. We spent months this spring and summer negotiating a deficit reduction agreement that allowed Congress to appropriate more than $11 billion in disaster aid for next year. Now, after an earthquake, weeks of wildfires, and a hurricane that slammed the eastern seaboard, we're asking to free up $6.9 billion in emergency funds to help Americans in need. There's a reason we've agreed in the past that disaster funding should be set aside from the regular budget process. There's a reason we agreed as part of July's deficit reduction agreement that it should be set aside once again. Farmers who have lost their crops to floods and families who have lost their homes to hurricanes shouldn't be used as pawns in a budget bidding war. Over the last 2 decades, almost 90% of the money Congress has authorized for disaster relief has been done outside the regular budget process. And why, Mr. President? because we cannot determine what Mother Nature is going to do. We do the best we can, but who would ever have dreamed that Irene would hit when it did with the devastation it did? Who would ever have dreamed that a tornado would level the town of Joplin, Missouri? So we've done the best we can. I ask my Republican colleagues, why should today be any different than the past? FEMA is running out of money. That's the bottom line. On Monday, Mr. President, they will be broke. The President's declared emergencies in 48 of the 50 states this year. And we've had 10 disasters already that have cost more than $1 billion each. It's been 30 years since we've had so many large natural disasters. As of this morning, FEMA's disaster fund had almost nothing left. It will be broke on Monday. The agency that rushes to help when disaster strikes, as I said, will be out of money in just a day or two. I repeat, Monday. And we're still in the middle of the hurricane season. Turn on the Weather Channel and you'll see why it's so important we give FEMA the resources it needs to react quickly to whatever Mother Nature sends our way. FEMA has already halted reconstruction projects in 40 states to free up funds to react to immediate needs of communities affected by the most recent disasters. Because of these delays, FEMA will take longer to rebuild bridges in New Hampshire and schools in Missouri and homes in Texas, all because of Republican stubbornness. Madam President, I'm sorry, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm stunned that we have senators from states who have been devastated by these disasters. One state, thousands of fires, 2,000 homes burnt. Why wouldn't people vote to help people who have had such devastation? It's all politics. FEMA's been there for people when the crops they've planted and count to make a living were drowned by floods. The federal government has always been there to help Americans in their hour of greatest need, when their homes were homes where their children were raised, spent holidays, and made memories, had burned to the ground, or been washed away or blown away. But because of the delays, FEMA will no longer be able to rebuild the bridges in countries where, for example, in the state of New Hampshire, I just heard my friend, the junior senator from Vermont, talk about New Hampshire. I'm talking about Vermont. Vermont, Mr. President, has had almost 200 bridges washed away, gone. Texas, we've had those fires. FEMA's been there when schools they study in and bridges they drive on have been rocked by earthquakes and blown away by tornadoes. And never before has Congress tried to nickel and dime the victims of these disasters. Americans have watched all this that they have go up in smoke or be washed or blown away. But that's what Republicans are doing today. They're shortchanging communities that can least afford the delays of partisan gridlock. Senator Majority Leader George Mitchell once said, quote, bipartisanship means you work together to work it out. American families and communities are relying on us to work together to work it out. I'm holding out hope that we won't disappoint them. Mr. President, go back just a month. We were struggling hard to work out an agreement that in years past has been simple. We were going to raise the debt limit of this country on bills we'd already accumulated. And it took 3 months, but we got it done. And one of the things we did is said that we'll no longer have fights during this next fiscal year on funding the government. We agreed on the numbers. Now, what the House could not do in good conscience directly, they're doing indirectly. They're sending us a short-term continuing resolution to fund the government till the middle part of November. But because they have all these extremists in the Republican majority in the House, they couldn't do that. They could not do that. They couldn't send us what they'd already agreed upon. In fact, they put an addition to the bill, a so-called rider to the bill, saying you're only going to be able to raise the debt ceiling if you agree on our number on emergencies, recognizing that their number will only last a few weeks. And here's what they did also that was so mean-spirited. As I've outlined here in detail, we haven't paid for these disasters because they're emergencies. They're not in the normal budget process. But the House took money for more efficient vehicles. They took that money and said, well, we're going to pay for $1 billion for the year 2011. The year 2011 ends, fiscal year ends, the end of this month, just a few days from now. Everyone has said we just need a few $1 million to take care of it until the end of this month. As I indicated, we have enough money till Monday, but that's all. The end of the month is not Monday. They took $1 billion when only a little bit was needed, stripped our ability to create jobs. I spoke to Steny Hoyer in the House. He said 52,000 jobs they're taking away from the American people by doing this. They take $1 billion and pay for this, but just to show further meanness, they take $500 million and rescind it. It doesn't go toward the debt. It goes for nothing. They just rescind it. And then, of course, for the year 2012, they put in an amount of money that really doesn't go very far with all these disasters, a few weeks' worth. So we'll be back having the same fight again, which is so senseless, so unnecessary. I would hope that the House of Representatives, there's going to be a vote today around 4 or 5 o'clock, and I know it'll be a close vote, but I hope people over here will understand how important this vote is. We're going to have a vote, as we've indicated, on this continuing resolution to strip out the mean-spirited amendment that they have in it, take it out, put what's already passed here by a substantial majority.